Good morning, students. This is chapter 10 on the muscular system. This is a big chapter, so you're going to have to spend some time on it. The body contains over 600 muscles. I'm going to try and focus on the main ones for you for an A&P during LPN school. Those muscles comprise about 40% of an adult's body weight. And then the rest on that first page are the different types of muscle, which you've already learned. So go ahead and review over that. But I'm not going to talk about that right now. Page 152 is the skeletal muscle structure, and that is something you do need to know. So star that. A skeletal muscle cell is a muscle fiber, and then the muscle fiber itself has a little bit of connective tissue that covers each of those fibers, and that's called the endomyosin, the inside of the muscle. So endomyosin around a single muscle fiber cell. And then muscle fiber cells then are grouped into small groupings called fascicles. And then they're wrapped around with another piece of connective tissue called the perimysium. And then these fascicles then are grouped together and wrapped around with the epimysin and surrounds the whole muscle as a whole. And then connective tissue also surrounds the outside of the muscle. Outside of the epimysin, you have the fascia. And I talked about fascia before, how it contains muscle compartments and it's not really stretchable. So if you have a muscle injury and you have swelling, sometimes they have to do what is called a fasciotomy, which they cut through the fascia to release the pressure. The body at work at the bottom, page 152, talks about direct attachment, indirect attachment of muscle fibers. And it talks about how muscle fibers merge with the periosteum of the bone to form a strong attachment to a bone. And then indirect attachment, the epimysium extends past the muscle as a tendon. And then that tendon merges with the periosteum. And then sometimes you will have a muscle attaches to another muscle, and it talks about that as well. They don't really, they're pretty strong, these tendons. They don't really break very easily, but they can pull away from a bone, and that can be very painful. Page 153 talks about the structure of the muscle fiber itself. And think about the cell structure that you learned a couple weeks ago. With the muscle fiber structure, you have the sarcolemma, which is the plasma membrane that surrounds that muscle fiber. And then you have the sarcoplasm. Think of the cytoplasm, but in a muscle fiber it's called the sarcoplasm. And then inside that sarcoplasm, you have these little myofibrils, and these are protein bundles that store energy. You also have the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which think of the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and these surround the myofibrils, and they store calcium ions. And within those myofibrils, you have smaller fibers that are called myofilaments, and you have thick ones. Thick myofilaments are the myosin, and the thin myofilaments are the actin, and they give that muscle that striated or striped appearance. And then there's these little transverse tubules that extend across the sarcoplasma, and these allow the electrical impulses to flow. And if you look at the bottom of page 153, it shows you a picture of what the thick filaments, myofilaments look like. They kind of have the heads facing outward, and they almost look like a golf club type appearance. And then the thin filaments look like a string of beads. And entwined within the actin are two other proteins, the tropomyosin and troponin. And troponin is something that you're going to hear about later on, especially with cardiac disease. People look at troponin levels with lab work. If those are elevated, it's an indication of possible of a heart attack, what we call a myocardial infarction. On page 154, it talks about the structure of a myofibril then. which we're getting into the very nitty gritty. You have thin and thick myofilaments. They stack together. They're alternating. They don't really completely overlap. It looks more like a lattice work. And the units that join them between the lattice work is called the sarcomeres. And there's a nice animation that goes with that, with your book. And it talks about a disc, a Z disc or a Z line is the anchor point for the thin myofilaments. And the section between the Z discs is called a sarcomere. And that's where the muscle contraction occurs. And when your muscle is relaxed, the myosin and the actin, they lie side by side. And you can see in the picture, they're not even touching each other. But when the contraction occurs, you have those myosin heads latch onto the actin myofilaments, and you have a cross bridge. And you can see that in towards the bottom of that page. They latch onto each other repeatedly, kind of like your book talks about a series of power strokes to bring those Z disc and closer together. It's called a sliding filament model of contraction. So watch the animation that goes with that. The myofilaments don't shorten, they stay the same length. The sarcomeres shorten because of the filaments lying over top of one another. And the body at work at the bottom of page 154 talks about muscle contraction requires energy in the form of ATP. That ATP allows the myosin heads to release the group on that actin filament, and it gives fuel to form a new cross bridge. Besides ATP, contraction also requires calcium, and we talked about calcium ions are stored in the myofibrils. So be aware that the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium and it binds with troponin during that contraction part itself as well. On page 155, it talks about muscle contraction and muscle relaxation. A skeletal muscle must be stimulated by a nerve. We call that a motor neuron. And remember what the neuron cell looks like. It's a body, a soma, and it has these axons that carry out impulses to the muscle, the skeletal muscles. The connection between a motor neuron and a muscle fiber is called a neuromuscular junction. And between the end of the motor neuron and the muscle fiber, we have this little space called the synaptic cleft. And then in the middle of page 155, it gives you step-by-step on how a muscle contracts. So read over that. You need the release of a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is necessary for the muscle contraction, and ATP is necessary for muscle contraction. And then when the muscles relax, you have the need for acetylcholinesterase, which is an enzyme. Anything that ends in ASE tends to be an enzyme. And enzymes that are usually named for the thing it acts upon. So acetylcholinesterase acts upon the acetylcholine to help allow that muscle fiber to relax. On page 156, there's a life lesson on different types of neuromuscular disorders. And you probably have seen some of them. I'm not going to name all of them. The one of them is talking about botulism from eating improperly canned foods. And you have paralysis of respiratory muscles, myasthenia gravis. You have the body producing antibodies against receptors for acetylcholine. And it results with profound muscle weakness. And then tetanus, which is a really interesting one, also known as lockjaw. It's from a bacteria which causes the motor neurons to fire excessively. And you get severe muscle spasm. Usually starts in the jaw, and that's why you get the term lockjaw, but then you get muscle spasms where the whole body contracts. And I've seen pictures from years ago when we didn't have medication to prevent this, where the whole back is arched and it leads to death. So read over that part. And then you have a discussion on muscle tone. The strength of a contraction depends on the length of the fibers before the muscle contraction begins. And it talks about the length tension relationship. I'm not going to ask you a lot about that middle part of that page, but I do want you to know the bottom paragraph there. It talks about the continuous state of partial contraction is called muscle tone. We have partial muscle contraction when we're just standing or holding our head up or sitting. We have to be, or otherwise our muscles will just flop down onto the floor. And it also gives us the ability to have that fight or flight response when there's danger, that we can act immediately. We have to have that muscle tone, that partial contraction. On page 157, it talks about the contraction of the entire muscle. Know some of the terms there, what a motor unit is, the threshold of the minimum voltage needed to cause a muscle fiber to contract, and one single brief contraction is called a twitch. Obviously, a muscle can't do anything with a twitch. You need many fibers contracting at the same time for work to be done. And they need to stay contracted for longer than a split second. So muscles are called upon to contract differently depending on the job that's needed. If I'm lifting a pen from the table, that requires a lot less muscle contraction than if I am going into my living room and lifting up the sofa, which I probably would have trouble doing that all by myself. Fast fact there is kind of interesting. It talks about rigor mortis, because at the time of death, the production of ATP stops. The myosin heads get locked onto the actin filaments, and that's what causes that muscle contraction, and the muscles become rigid. And rigor mortis peaks about 12 hours after death, and I've experienced that as a hospice nurse. I've come upon patients who have died, sometimes even in facilities, and obviously people haven't checked on them because when I find them, they're stiff, so they've been dead probably 12 hours at that point. Another interesting thing is the bottom page 157 on sports and muscle fibers. They think there's slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers, which are interesting. Slow twitch fibers have a lot of mitochondria, which are our powerhouse of cells and rich blood supply. They don't they kind of respond a little more slowly, but they can sustain activity for a long period of time. So we think of our endurance runners as having a lot of slow twitch fibers. And then the fast twitch fibers don't have as much mitochondria and not as much blood supply, but they can absorb and release calcium quickly. And so we think of our sprinters having fast twitch fibers. And then on page 158, it talks about stimulus energy, what the definition of TREP is, when muscle contracts several times in a row, in almost a staircase response. The last contraction will be stronger than the one before it. The other one in the middle there talks about impulses reach muscle fibers fast, and fibers don't have a chance to relax completely before the next impulse arrives. And then you have this building contraction that builds on the force of the contraction before it. That's called a state of incomplete tetanus. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the bottom one talks about complete tetanus, when impulses arrive so fast the muscle can't relax at all. Think of a woman in labor about ready to have birth, and the muscle contraction stays up on this peak. I had that happen with my first daughter. I thought my uterus was in the state of complete tetanus. I looked at my husband and basically said goodbye because it hurt so bad. But you have one prolonged contraction that doesn't seem to want to stop. The body at work at the bottom of 158 talks about most skeletal muscles are normally in a state of incomplete tetanus because of the rapid fire succession of Over time, your muscle fibers will get tired and they have to relax somewhere at some point. And so you have some of them relaxing and some of them firing and contracting at the same time. Think of in a choir, I think about the one time I was in a choir and I had to hold this long note. Well, the whole choir was holding this long note. I couldn't hold the note the whole time, and nobody else could hold the note that long time either, but we all took a little breath at different times. So the note stayed sounding like everybody was holding the note, but we were all getting our little breaths here or there. And that's kind of how that incomplete tetanus works. The top of page 159, I'm not going to ask a whole lot about, but the bottom of 159 AM, isotonic and isometric contractions, you need to know the difference between those. The isometric, the tension of the muscle increases, but the length remains the same. Or isotonic contraction, the muscle changes length to move a load. Thinking of lifting a barbell. With that, and that makes sense at the bottom, helps you understand the difference between isotonic and isometric, so get to know that. On page 160, the main thing I want you to understand with that part is that when you're exercising and you're burning oxygen, after a while your body can't keep up, and you start having instead of aerobic respiration going on, you start having anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration can generate energy as well, but and it's good for if you're like sprinting and you need a lot of energy real quick. But one of the reasons why one of the byproducts of that is a buildup of what we call lactic acid. And it accumulates in the muscle and leads to muscle fatigue. Your muscles get tired. So that fast fact at the bottom, it talks about when you go for the burn and strenuous exercise, the burn is the symptom of the lactic acid accumulation from anaerobic respiration. And the other thing under the body at work, it talks about, after strenuous exercise, lactic acid goes back to the liver sometimes, and converted to glucose, but sometimes that conversion consumes a lot of oxygen when that's taking place. So after you've had strenuous exercise, you tend to breathe heavy for a while afterwards, and that's a result of the body trying to process that lactic acid. On page 161, then, it talks about the different muscle functions, the origin, the belly, the insertion, knowing what a prime mover is, synergist, antagonist, and knowing the definition of hypertrophy and atrophy. And then it's just getting into the muscles, where they're located. Page 164, how the muscles are named. And then it goes from head down to the body. Get to know what the rotator cuff injury is. We see that a lot with people my age and a little bit older. Knowing muscles are named often for where they're located. I give an example. The sternocleidomastoid muscle starts the sternum. It goes up over the clavicle and then up towards the mastoid process behind the ear. So that gives you kind of an idea where some of these muscles are located. It's a lot of memorization. So get down on the floor and draw on a paper tablecloth again and write them out. Do your workbook. Do the questions at the end of the chapter. Use your online resources and flashcards. But it's going to take you the week to learn where all the muscles are located. One other thing I really liked was on page 170, the hamstrings are really important for us to be able to stay upright. And it's kind of gruesome, but that fast fact on page 170, ancient knights would use their swords to slice the back of opponents' thighs and make them immobile. Kind of interesting. And then the Achilles tendon is another thing I wanted you to know about on 171. It's vulnerable to sudden stress, such as sprinting, and a lot of times you'll hear people having athletic injuries to the Achilles tendon. And then page 172 gives a nice synopsis of all the major muscles of the body and the effects of aging and exercise and muscle conditioning. Know your key terms. Class, I wish I could spend some more time with you on this. Maybe talk to each other and see if you can help each other learn them. Give me an email if you're having problems, okay? Thank you.